Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live, work and write on the land of the Gadigal people. As I try to tread lightly on country, I extend my respect to elders past, present and emerging, as well as to any Aboriginal Australians who might be joining us here this morning. My name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales. One of the more exciting parts of my job is to coordinate the Scholar Talk series. This is the very first time that we've done this online, but we've got some great people behind the scenes making sure that it all works. And we also have a great speaker today. It's a real treat to be able to introduce this morning Richard Neville. Richard is an art historian and he is, of course, the Mitchell Librarian at the State Library. And today he's going to be talking about John William Lewin, and he literally did write the book on Lewin. So when your local library opens, you can go and have a look at this really beautiful volume that came out just a few years ago, written by Richard and published by New South. So Richard is going to talk about Lewin today and some of his favourite pictures from the library's collection. Thank you, Richard.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, and I hope everyone can hear me. This is indeed the first time I have tried to do an online lecture, so we'll see how it all goes. So very keen to talk to you today about John Lewin. He's someone who has been of tremendous interest to me for really since I started out using the library way back in really the early 1980s. John Lewin is one of these fascinating characters who I think Australian art history specialises in a way. He's someone who, if we can get him, sorry, he's someone who has really very little profile. Increasingly, perhaps his profile has grown somewhat in the last 20 odd years, but he is an intriguing person because he really represents in many ways the way that Europeans colonised Australia, if you like, intellectually as well as physically. And he's someone who, to a certain extent, has to be retrieved from the archive because he's not a person who left of himself a lot of records. He's not a person who seems to have had a wide and extensive series of correspondence. So a lot of what we know about him, and a lot of what I, in my own time, have been trying to do, is to actually retrieve as much as we can from the scant records and piece together something of this person. Now, John Lewin was born in London in 1770, and his father was a natural history. Had started off life, in fact, as a fabric designer, but had become fascinated with natural history illustration, and in fact published a number of books on British natural history. And he was part of that whole community of people interested in natural history. Sir Joseph Banks is often seen at the kind of apogee of that interest, but people like William Lewin, John's father, were tradesmen in a way who upskilled themselves, and they never really participated to the same extent. They certainly wouldn't have counted the circle that surrounded Sir Joseph Banks as their friends and colleagues. They were the people who tended to serve the gentleman scholars who we most know about. So Lewin seems to have learned his skills as an illustrator and as a printmaker, sitting at his father's knee, if you like. And he decided, he helped his father publish his books, Birds of Great Britain, and another book on the butterflies of Great Britain. He contributed etchings and also watercolours to those particular endeavours, and clearly was influenced by his father's passion for natural history. Now, he decided in the late 1790s that he would come to Australia because he wanted to pursue his career as a natural historian. He also wanted to publish his own books, and he clearly thought that moving to Australia was one way that he could further his career. And he had some quite legitimate reasons for wanting to come to Australia. You know, one of the issues that plagued, if you like, British natural history illustration, and particularly natural history illustration from distant colonies, was the quality of the specimens that were arriving. And you can see on this screen here, one of the first, an image at the top right, one of the top left rather, one of the first free public museum at Sir Ashton Lever's Laverian Museum in 1985. And this, in fact, was the very height of fashionable museology, musicology in London at the time. It was run by an individual called Sir Ashton Lever, who put into this museum and lost indeed his fortune. The white showcase, as you can see, against which the specimens were placed, was an innovation that he introduced. And a lot of Australian natural history ended up in his kind of very eclectic and bizarrely arranged collection. Now you can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but if you look into some of the cases, there are these birds with their heads facing over the sort of back of their body. These are the specimens which natural history artists were using to illustrate specimens from across the world. I've also, and the problems that flowed from that are actually quite practical, but they have far-reaching implications. If you want to draw a bird, or if you want to draw an animal, accurately, the best way to do that is indeed to stop it moving, and the best way to stop it moving is clearly to kill it. And clearly, once you've actually killed a specimen, the issues you then face is it's obviously going to start to disintegrate. So the next step is to actually skin the animal. And what was happening from New South Wales in particular was that animals would be shot in New South Wales. They would then be put into some preservative, typically a kind of liquid. They would then be sent back to England, where someone in England would look at this specimen, at the skin of this specimen, and have to somehow try and recreate the body shape. And you can see in this page 3 drawings of a masked lapwing or a spur-winged plover, a very common bird around Sydney. If any of you know them, they're short and squat, as you can see the top drawing by a man called George Prideaux Harris, which was actually made in Tasmania in 1806 rather. But the 2 bottom drawings were made in, well, we don't really know where they were made, but they're made in the 1790s, possibly in Sydney, maybe in India. But clearly the tall, elongated bird looks nothing like a lapwing and a masked lapwing. And so my supposition is that these are in fact specimens which had been shot, then sent to another location, and the artist, beautifully rendering these illustrations, but has actually had to try and recreate the specimen in a way that is in fact completely inaccurate. Now, John Lewin was aware of these problems with natural history illustration. It was widely understood that many of the specimens coming back from around the world into England, which was a huge kind of sinkhole of specimens, were in pretty poor shape. So he decided that he would come to New South Wales, and where he could actually see nature in situ. And he felt that that would then allow him to publish books about Australian natural history, presumably kind of kickstart his career in a way, and it would allow him to establish himself as a naturalist of some repute. Intriguingly, he set out for New South Wales in 1798 with his wife, and they were all aboard a ship called the Buffalo, well kitted out. Everything had been put on board. He and his wife were on board. For some reason, he decided to step ashore for a moment. The wind blew up, and the captain said to his wife, well, we've really got to leave now. Poor Maria, her husband rather, was on shore. She was on the boat, and she made the decision that she wouldn't get off. She'd actually stay on board. So the ship headed off to New South Wales. Poor old John was left in Plymouth. He then had to catch the next boat to New South Wales. And while his wife he in fact, it took him about 8 months longer to get to New South Wales. And he arrives in Sydney in January 1800. Terrible things. He ends up in or arrives when his wife is in the middle of a defamation case because she'd been accused of all sorts of licentious behaviour, drunkenness and so on board her voyage out. And so when he arrives in New South Wales, his wife is in the middle of this defamation case. And that may seem like a kind of amusing anecdote, but it was actually really serious, because had his wife's reputation been damaged by those allegations, then it is highly likely that John's own access to the people he needed to support him would have just not been there, because they would have been social pariahs, and he couldn't have actually worked the networks he needed in the colonial elite to support his endeavours. Now on this screen now you can see two drawings, and I think one of the things about Lewin, I think he's a very hard man to actually get a real sense of, but to actually come out to New South Wales in 1800, pursuing this career, he had some support from home. A wealthy entomologist, insect collector, had set him up with engraving plates and guns and collecting apparatus. But it was a really courageous thing to do. And when he gets to New South Wales, he finds it, perhaps not surprising to us, but it seemed to have been surprising to him, completely different to anything he expected. Now, on this drawing, on this page, you can see two drawings of Bohemian waxwing, which was the kind of illustration Lewin was typically making when he was in England in the 1790s. And on the right, you can see what I think is a truly amazing bit of natural history illustration. It's a drawing he made in 1800, and it was actually owned by Captain John Hunter. And although looking at that drawing, it may not seem particularly sort of surprising, particularly given people's understanding of natural history illustration these days, it is in fact a kind of dramatically radical engagement with natural history, and takes him far beyond where he had been. And he's only been in New South Wales for 6 or 8 months when he makes this drawing. To dissect the page the way he does with the xanthorrhea, to have the bird lifelike hanging on to the bud of the plant, is just so completely atypical to what was happening in England at the time, which is represented much more by his earlier work. This work is in fact a kind of startlingly modern engagement with Australian natural history, and that seems to have been the thing that really made an impact on Lewin. Coming to New South Wales, he talks about everything was contrary to his known knowledge in England. So he had to kind of, when he was looking for specimens, they weren't where he typically thought he would find them. So he had to kind of relearn the whole craft of capturing specimens, locating specimens, and then I think confronted by this amazing sort of natural history that he was seeing, it seems to have popped his eyes open to this whole new way of observation. And these two beautiful drawings here, both 1803, you can clearly see these eucalypts. You can clearly see the kind of quality of the observation, but you can also see that he's actually become compositionally much more adventurous. So the kind of strong diagonals that reach across the drawings themselves are again very atypical of natural history illustration at the time, which tended to sit the specimens right in the middle of the page. So the specimen would be, or the plant or whatever was being illustrated would be sitting in the middle of the page, surrounded by kind of white space. Lewin seems to throw away all the conventions of his training. And mind you, he's not actually surrounded by a strong natural history community. He's coming up with a lot of these observations himself. He has some fellow colonists who are interested in natural history, but he really doesn't have a kind of milieu in which he can operate. And one of his friends, in fact, says he didn't know how to write the language of natural history. So it seems to me it's quite clear that someone like Lewin is, in fact, very much still that sense of, he's not what we think these days of scientists. And in fact, science as a kind of discipline is something that's much more into the 19th century. Lewin was someone who was a skilled working class tradesman who collected specimens for other people, very much so. He had a trade. When he comes to New South Wales, he begins collecting for people in Europe, but also people in the colony. puts together collections, and also wants to publish books. So he's not part of that gentleman's set of scientists, but he's a practical, and in fact he was described by the Linnaean Society as a practical naturalist. So someone who didn't talk science, didn't necessarily classify, he wasn't into Linnaean taxonomy, and in fact many colonists note his lack of ability to talk about taxonomy. But I'm impressed by him because what really I find fascinating is the way that his whole kind of visual language just becomes so interesting and so well observed. You know, you can see here on the acacia plant on the right, on the left here, just again that sense of the diagonal, and he hasn't tried to replicate a beautifully finished acacia specimen. You can see some of the flowers have died, some of the leaves have browned. It's actually a really well observed drawing of a natural plant. You know, he hasn't tried to prettify it for an illustrative purposes. And similarly, the blue wrens you can see on the right of the screen, this kind of format you can see here, the wrens are punched out, if you like. It's almost like he's photoshopped the images and he's pushed back, he's greyed out the plants behind. This was a kind of, and it's a really effective, again, a really effective composition, but he seems to have come up with that. He uses it about 1808 to 1812 because he stays in the colony, or he comes here in 1800 and dies here in 1819 and never really leaves. This was just a sort of technique that somehow emerged, and he played around with it, used it very creatively, and then drops it from the 1810s onward. Really don't know why, but again, stressing this sense that Lewin was someone who kind of had a creative renaissance once he comes to New South Wales, and he's confronted by the issues of engaging with a completely new flora and fauna. Now, again, this sense, he says his friends in the colony tend not to be the colonial elite, although he does have relationships, collecting relationships with every governor that he works with. So he seems to have been provided collections or drawings to Governor Hunter. He made a substantial collections for Governor Phillip. He made some collections for Governor King. He made some collections for Governor Bligh when he was briefly in New South Wales before obviously he was overthrown in 1808. And then he actually is employed by Macquarie not only as a public servant, which we'll get to a bit later, but also as he provides some drawings for him. But you know, he does one of the kind of themes I think that he kind of continues to work on is this sense that he really has to come to terms with new ways of collecting and new ways of illustrating the works, specimens that he's finding. Now, and he says one of his friends is a man called John Grant, who is a convict, who's probably these days he would be before the court. He was a stalker, if you like. He had a very unfortunate infatuation with a young woman back in Europe, which led to his removal to New South Wales. And he takes up with John Lewin. They become friends, and but as a convict and then as an ex-convict, the fact that Lewin chooses to socialise with a man like John Grant certainly puts him into a social position, which was very important in the colony at the time. John Lewin comes out here as I said, as a kind of working class man with some trade skills, and to actually socialise with people like John Grant and other tradesmen, or implies that when he was thinking of his own social position within colonial society, he certainly didn't see himself as part of the colonial elite. He saw himself very much as part of that skilled trades, that kind of large skilled tradesman class. And But he was also, I think, socially quite ambitious, and he certainly feels that when he comes to New South Wales, that possibly New South Wales gives him an opportunity for social advancement, an aspiration. He's in fact one of the kind of first aspirational Australians, I think. As I said, in terms of the patrons that he works with, these two drawings were taken from a large collection he made of watercolours for Governor King. But the library has about 206 of these in its collections. The Waratah on the right is from from this collection. It's a beautiful drawing. You can see one of the things that I think often and perhaps portrays to a certain extent this sense that Lewin couldn't really talk science. He does provide at the bottom, say, the Waratah drawing and indeed the bottom of the Baronia drawing. You can see that what are often called diagnostic illustrations, so the kind of cross sections, which when this drawing would be sent back to England, someone with some natural history skills could look at these particular parts of the plant's, particularly flowers construction, and that would help them provide some kind of taxonomic understanding or place the plant into this idea of the taxonomy that people like Linnaeus had been coming up with. And indeed, a lot of English natural history was very much around the naming and describing of plant specimens rather than seeing plants in terms of a wider ecology. British collectors tended to be very keen on being able to identify and provide names to particular specimens. And this seems to have been what Governor King was doing. He wanted to put together a large collection of plants. Cruelly, it was said he was doing it more for show and had indeed very little interest in science, but felt that if he had this collection, it kind of would add to his sense of prestige, if you like. And the other sort of aspect of a lot of this natural history collecting was that patrons would acquire works by Lewin, which they would then send on to people in Europe as tokens of esteem and gifts, diplomatic gifts of diplomacy to encourage some sense of to encourage a relationship that they may want to promote to sort of further their own careers. And that seems to what a lot of these how Lewin in fact benefited a lot from that, because people would acquire his works to send to people who they wanted to impress. Lewin does publish 2 books. He first starts Prodromus Entomology, which he prepares in 1803 from a series that's Lepidopterous insects, so moths and so on. That book is sent off to England. The plates are sent off to England with his kind of pattern set. So he sends the copper plates, which he has engraved, which he has etched in the colony. They are sent off to England with coloured versions of them. And then it is published in England under the patronage of one of the great entomologists of the day, Alexander Macleay. That book is published in 1805. And while he's preparing that book, he begins to put together a book called Birds of New Holland, which he travels around the colony or around Sydney, finds 76 or 79 subscribers for that book, sends it off to England round about 1806. News is released in the Sydney Gazette. The book is about to arrive in 1808. But sadly, it never arrives. It seems to have been eight versions of the 8 copies of Birds of New Holland have survived, all in library collections. The rest of the run seems to have been destroyed. Possibly on its voyage out to New South Wales, it was damaged, and it seems likely that that disaster meant that Lewin gave up all hope of ever trying to publish books about Australian natural history, because the kind of just the hurdles to actually finally get something to print were so substantial that it was a real issue for him. He does, in fact, in 1813, he turns around and publishes something he calls Birds of New South Wales. And that's one of the great bibliographic rarities of Australian publishing history. 13 copies have survived, and our library is very lucky to have 4 of those. They now valued around about $500,000 each, so they're very rare. Lewin compiled these volumes from, obviously as he had been preparing his books, he'd made quite a few print runs to make sure the prints were working, to colour them up, and he had a whole lot of spare proofs, which he then binds together, writes his own text, which is kind of naively simplistic but quite charming, and issues it as Birds of New Holland. Surprisingly, there's absolutely no, of Birds of New South Wales rather, and surprisingly there's no acknowledgement anywhere that I can see in that book in local press. It just kind of appears without comment, but clearly it was something he felt was important for himself to do. After the failure of his books, he pretty much turns to this idea that he's going to make these large format watercolours, and this is seems to be for him a market that he can mine quite successfully. So these watercolours are all, they're probably 60 centimetres by 40 centimetres each. They're designed to be framed, hung on walls. He could charge around about £12 for, say, one of these Gymea lilies. The platypus will presumably similar prices, and that for him really is probably a much more lucrative market. And they're kind of moving away from natural history illustration into more dynamic works of art, if you like. And indeed, the naturalist Alan Cunningham described them as being more for show than for correctness. So in other words, these were things that were designed to be hung on walls, given to people. It said that the walls of First Government House were decorated with a significant tranche of illustrations of both Aboriginal people, but also natural history, which Lewin had provided. Although I've seen about 3 references to that, but there's no evidence of these things actually surviving. It'd be great if they did. He certainly worked with people like William Patterson, who was one of the colonial administrators up until 1809. And this is his drawing. Patterson had lived down in Tasmania, had set up a colony in Tasmania, comes up to New South Wales in 1809 or so, and obviously brings with him a Tasmanian tiger, which he gives Lewin to illustrate, and this is a result. This somewhat bizarre-looking creature. Clearly, it's a Tasmanian tiger, but again, I would suggest that this has been drawn from a specimen, which is why it looks so awkward. And again, it sort of illustrates the issues that working from stuffed specimens or from skins led to in that time. Lewin was certainly prepared to mine a popular subject, and koalas surprisingly didn't come into the colony, didn't come into Sydney until 1803. Lewin was there when they came in, and so there was a bit of press about them arriving, and everyone was terribly excited by them. And the drawing up here at the top right seems to have been the first drawing that Lewin made of a koala, and indeed it's one of the earliest drawings extant of koalas. Unfortunately for Lewin, I suppose, he was sitting next to Ferdinand Bough, who was perhaps the greatest natural history illustrator of the 19th century, and they were kind of dueling koala illustrations, and people perhaps a little unfairly felt that Bow's were a lot more scientifically accurate than Lewin's, which is probably true, but Lewin's actually have much more life to them, because Bow was recreating his specimens from colour charts back in England. These were drawn from life. This one here was owned, down the bottom right, was owned by Governor King. And you can certainly see the kind of way he gets the texture of Australian natural history, but things like scale always troubled Lewin. So the size of this leaf, this eucalypt, is actually the size of the koala's face, which is perhaps suggests some of the issues that he sometimes had with scale and so on. But this was a drawing that he reproduced 3 or 4 times, so clearly it found a ready market for him. He painted less landscapes. Natural history was his forte, but interestingly, the way he approached it, This is a drawing of Governor Bly's farm, controversial farm in Blytown, on the Hawkesbury River. And it's really a very interesting illustration. I think it portrays some of his lack of familiarity with the landscape format. Here we see a tree, a dead eucalypt, stuck in the middle of a drawing of a watercolour. Typically, had he been much more familiar with the kind of aesthetics of landscape illustration, he would have moved the tree over here and probably put over to the right or to the side of the painting to kind of frame it. But I think his naturalist instincts kick in here, and he's pretty much drawing the landscape as he sees it. When he's asked by the Macquaries to turn it into, Governor Macquarie and his wife, to turn it into a formal landscape, he tries to deploy much more the idea of the landscape aesthetic that he would have been familiar with in England. So this drawing of the Hawkesbury becomes much more romantic, if you like, and the soft diffused light is an attempt to kind of soften, to romanticize the landscape and to suggest its fecundity. And that drawing is then taken, but again, the tree sticks in the middle. When it's reinterpreted again by an engraver for a 1813 engraving, the tree kind of more conventionally moves to the right of the image to help frame it. So again, I suppose in a sense, Lewin's emphasis and instincts were much more around a natural history aesthetic, but when he's required, he does try and apply some of what he might have known about landscape painting. Again, just to kind of show that when one is looking at colonial art, one always has to be aware that there are two ways of viewing things. These are two drawings of Sydney Code, pretty much the same time, 1809, 1808. Lewin is down the bottom, George William Evans is up the top. And it's hard to imagine that these two towns are the same place. But when one is assessing the informational value of a lot of early colonial art, it's always important to try and put together as many sources as you can, because two artists can have completely different views of the same place, or different interpretations of the same place, which tends to reflect their training and their instincts. Probably Sydney was somewhere in between this very green and sort of villagey look and Lewin's dark and light and dusty town, which is, some of its colour has faded, but I think you get a sense of the kind of regularity that George William Evans is promoting against the sort of the more looser interpretation of John Lewin. Lewin did go on, was taken by Governor Macquarie across the Blue Mountains, and in Macquarie's triumphant sort of trek across the mountains when the road was first opened in 1815. Macquarie was going in this kind of triumphal procession to the new lands that were going to open up the colony. And one of the things that impressed Europeans when they got to this Wiradjuri country was that there weren't many trees on it, which meant that from their perspective, it was open land that obviously they felt that their flocks could inhabit without any clearing. And without thinking the implications behind that idea. But this is Lewin's view of the Macquarie River. And again, you can see he has been asked to kind of create the nirvana that people were suggesting this land was. And the drawing of the campsite is Lewin retreating more to his idea of the natural history, the natural historian in him. So he's drawn pretty much what he sees in front of him, and indeed had a more accomplished artist used to kind of including figures in their illustration attempted this work. These, you can see three figures in it which all are completely disconnected. Someone more used to genre painting, for instance, or illustrating humans would have made those figures interact, but Lewin's kind of aesthetic in drawing pretty much what he sees in front of him, I think, rules the way there. Now, Lewin makes a living in New South Wales, and I think it's interesting. His publications were not successful, but he does make a living selling these kind of celebrity natural history illustrations. For a while after the books fail, he opens a public house and a store, a general store with his wife. He opens an art school, although there's no record of how successful that was. He is sent by Macquarie on conciliation expeditions with Aboriginal people. It said his wife records later that he knew how to speak some of the languages. Again, very little evidence of that has survived. He apparently painted portraits. Again, none of those have survived. In 1810, interestingly, he is appointed coroner by Governor Macquarie at £40 a year, which would have given him some financial stability. There's no evidence that he had any qualifications for being a coroner, apart from the fact he killed things and knew how to dissect them. But it's nonetheless something that gives him two things. A, gives him financial stability in that his salary from £40 is increased to £80, and it also gives him social cachet. And coroners were typically gentlemen, so could sign themselves a squire. So, which was a kind of a word that implied gentlemanly status. And Lewin increasingly begins to describe himself as John William Lewin, a squire. In the 1810s, when he has this new role as coroner, he begins to move away from the sense of his being simply a natural history illustration, and he becomes more ambitious in the way he tackles painting. So this large fish catch at Dawes Point is something that probably dates from around 1815, and is an attempt to attack oils. And this, for him, was a significant milestone. He writes in a letter in 1813 that he's begun to do oil painting, and he alludes to the fact that he knows about Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was president of the Royal Academy and one of the greatest English artists. So it seems that he's beginning to see that he's not going to simply be a natural history illustrator, but he's trying to shift himself into fine art. And you can see this in later illustrations too. These are two watercolours around about 1818 from specimens that were collected by John Oxley in his expeditions into the Western New South Wales. Now Lewin, again these, and I think you can see, unlike his earlier illustrations when he's actually working from life, but these are very much drawings made from specimens. The crested pigeon's necks, for instance, are far too long, and clearly he's kind of got the scale wrong there. But he has the complexity of the compositions, again, is what is interesting. And these drawings were commissioned by Governor Macquarie, who was obviously keen to use Lewin's illustrations to promote his success as a governor, really promote his success in the government. They were sent back to Earl Bathurst, who was the secretary for the colonies in London. And Macquarie was sending textual reports. He was fighting with Bathurst. He was writing justifications for the programs that he was implementing. He was informing Bathurst about his policies to do with convicts and so on. And he had a kind of barrage of information and correspondence back to Bathurst, to Lord Bathurst, to explain and encourage Bathurst into accepting what he was trying to do. But these were kind of weaponized, if you like, watercolors, which he was sending to Macquarie, to Bathurst, which Macquarie was sending to Bathurst, as gifts to illustrate the kind of curious natural history that the colony was throwing up. And its natural history was the colony's natural history was one of the ways its governors and its leading colonial officials tried to argue for its value. The colony's unique natural history was part of the kind of equation of the value of the colony. It had obviously riches in terms of its land and the capacity to grow wool and wheat and so on. The other side of that was the economic advantage, the kind of social and in many ways emotional advantage of the colony, or the emotional and kind of the way that colonists began to colonize the colony intellectually as well as physically, was to embrace its natural history as this kind of amazingly unusual material and beautiful artifacts which added luster to its kind of commercial and physical landscapes. And Lewin's watercolours are part of that complexity. They are the kind of the curvaceous design within them is kind of, again, another degree of advancement in the way he was promoting his own art. And it's interesting that there are little, I think, tricks you can see in the way he kind of indicators that he's beginning to see himself as something more than a natural history illustrator. This is the signature you can see here at the top left, the signature that he creates or he puts onto his platypus watercolour, and he signs as I.W. Lewin, ALS, Associated Linnean Society, New South Wales, 1810. And that is very much the signature of someone who sees themselves as a natural history illustrator. By these drawings, this is another series of from this signature you can see at the bottom left. He's actually scratched into the watercolour, and it's a signature of an artist rather than of an illustrator. And I think you can see throughout the 1810s, as he moves away from the his earlier period in the colony, pre-1810, when he defines himself as a natural history illustrator, once he assumes the new role as coroner, he begins to completely reconceptualize himself. So, as I said in the beginning, he saw himself, probably comes out here as a working class tradesman. Through his time in the colony, he decides that he's kind of going to go to sort of social advancement. Now, class is a really important issue in colonial society, and particularly in the sort of early parts of the decade and early parts of the century. And how you conceive of yourself from a class position actually then help you slot yourself into colonial society. And one's class position actually kind of did provide quite strong barriers around how you actually operated as an individual. For Lewin, class was a significant issue. I think in the end of the century, towards the end of the decade, he does begin to sign himself off as a gentleman, John William Lewin, Esquire. And so clearly in his own mind, he's made that transition from working class tradesman to gentleman. Other colonists didn't agree with him. He in fact died, but there was a discussion about a commission that he could take to create a panorama of New South Wales. And the letter writer says, well, if a gentleman makes the illustration, we'll give them some silver plate. But if Mr. Lewin makes the illustration, we will pay him £30. And this was written in 1820. And that shows clearly that although Lewin may have begun to see himself as a gentlemen, or people who did see them who kind of were considered gentlemen, still saw him as the tradesman and were not prepared to offer him the silver plate, but give him the £30, which was very much their sense that you didn't pay a gentleman, but you did pay a working class man. But nonetheless, Lewin describes Australia as the finest country in the world. I think he, to a certain extent, that was easy for him to do because he did very well here. And in fact, he was a big fish in a very small pond. Had he remained in England, he would have been a minnow in a kind of in a country full of natural history illustrators and artists. So the move to New South Wales for Lewin was very fortuitous, and it allowed him a kind of lifestyle and a reputation that he never would have achieved in England. And interestingly, when his son applies to come out, after Lewin dies in 1819, he falls suddenly ill. And you can see his tombstone here, which is provided for him by Governor Macquarie. And ironically, it says he is mourned by his few friends. So we don't know what that really means. It seems a somewhat unkind epitaph to leave on a tombstone. But Lewin, once he dies, he has one son here, William Arden Lewin. Once Lewin dies in 1819, his wife, Maria, hightails back to England as soon as she can with her son. And her son wants to come back to in 1820. Her son wants to come back in 1828. And he asks if he can have a passage out to New South Wales. And he says, the land of my birth will give me better opportunities. So I think that's a really kind of quite interesting sense that young William Lewin considered New South Wales as his home. And I think that's a sort of an interesting sense of the emerging understanding from people who were Europeans right from the word go, committed to New South Wales, regardless of the kind of implications of the First Nations inhabitants. Now, as I say, Lewin dies in 1819, and really that's the end of his influence, and it's kind of quite sad in a way, because his natural history was not spectacularly the kind of quality of his natural history work. His illustration is very good, but the science behind it is not so strong. A lot of the birds he illustrated, he feeling he'd done them for the first time, had already been previously illustrated by other naturalists. But Lewin doesn't seem to have read previous texts or sort of boned up on coming out to New South Wales. So he was, in that sense, he wasn't highly educated as a collector. His published works were sadly few, and their impact seems to have been limited. And while a number of birds have been named after him, really his legacy is kind of fairly limited. But for me, I think what is fascinating about him is he's someone who in many ways represents many of the streams of the European colonisation of Australia. He comes to New South Wales as a free settler. He becomes an aspirational Australian. He kind of really adopts New South Wales as a place he can grow into. His art is just transformed by coming here. Which is kind of interesting in its own right. And I think in many ways he typifies a sense that is often misunderstood. To a certain extent, I think it's something that Kate Grenville was trying to grasp in The Secret River. What was it actually like for someone who comes from London, ends up in this strange place, and makes a life of it, and actually makes more than a life of it, becomes kind of enmeshed in it. It's this kind of cultural and emotional colonisation, which is probably in many ways much more important to understand than the sort of sheer physical occupation. And we can understand how New South Wales and Australia indeed is occupied by Europeans, but the occupation is underpinned by a kind of emotional and a cultural occupation. And I think Lewin is a really interesting example of someone who is very much part of that process. So I think we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. Lewin is such a terrific story, and I love this idea of artists dueling it out to see who can draw the best koala for sale. We do have time for a few questions, if anybody has some questions for Richard. Oh, we've got a few coming in. So you've spoken a little bit this morning, Richard, about the class system and how that really did impact Lewin in every stage of his life. Did he die in poverty like
no
artist?
He didn't, and that's, I think, one of the interesting why he probably was so fond of Australia, because he as a I think he was actually thinking of going back in 1809, and then the arrival of Governor Macquarie, going back to England rather, and the arrival of Governor Macquarie in 1810, and then the job as a coroner, then in a way gives him some financial stability, which he can then build on. And ultimately the coroner's job gives him £80 a year. He has a very nice house, apparently, according to advertisements at its sale, on Brickfield Hill, which is up near Central. It's just, it's quite a large house, commodious. After he dies, Macquarie, in fact, gives his widow a block of land in George Street, which she then promptly sells for about £600 or so, and goes back to England. So, in many ways, I think he actually was much more financially secure here than he ever could have been in in England, and I think that's probably why for him New South Wales was, and for his son too, you know, was a place of opportunity. Yeah.
A really tough question now. I think this question is too hard to ask. What is your favourite Lewin watercolour and why?
For me, the acacia, which I think I showed earlier on, just the branch of the tree kind of drooping down from top left to right. I first saw that, I don't know, probably in the early 1980s, and just the kind of freshness of it, the strength of the kind of the design, and just that sense of life and death. It's just a really, in fact, I have it hanging. Well, I don't have it hanging up in my office, clearly not, but I have a.
We're not a lending library
No,
for anybody who needs that confirmed.
But I do have a copy of that in my office, and it is one of my favourite works in the whole collection, in fact, in the library's whole collection. And
does anybody know where the copper plates are for the book, The Birds of New South Wales? No, it's presumed that they, it seems he was given these plates by a guy called Drew Drury of Drury Lane, who was an entomologist, and he comes out with about 50 copper plates. Alexander Macleay who was another entomologist or collector, sends out more copper plates. And I think what has happened is that they have been sent back, well, they were definitely sent back to England because the books were printed in England from copper plates that were made here. And really, I suppose, in the sort of trajectory of a lot of those publishing houses which closed in the late 19th, early 20th century, they've just gone missing somewhere. But who knows, I mean, curious things turn up in the archives all over the place. So hopefully one of these days they may turn up, but someone will recognise what they are. Someone will recognise them, yeah. Yeah. Somebody's asking now where Lewin was buried and if it's possible to sort of add to the number of his few friends and go and look at his... Yes, he was. He was in the Devonshire Street Cemetery, of course. And, well, not of course, that's where he was buried. When the cemetery was demolished in 1901, and if anyone cares to go and listen to the library's podcast, Dead Central, they can hear all about that story. His tombstone was actually moved out to the Botany Bay Cemetery, and you can go and still see it out there. Sadly, I mean, I haven't been out there for a number of years, but last time I was out there, it has been blasted by the ocean breezes, and it is sandstone, and it's kind of being weathered away. There's a whole lot of colonial land, of colonial tombstones that have been taken from Devonshire Street and put out there, and you know, they're all been damaged, I think, irreparably by the weather. But he's out there, and you can go and see him. And I used to when I was younger, pre-children. I would go out there and we'd have with some colleagues, and we'd go and have a look at him. Thanks so much, Richard, and thank you to everybody who's tuned in today for this, our very first online Scholar Talk. We'll be online again in June. Please join us to hear our Australian Religious History Fellow, Dr. Stephen Jackson. He's going to be chatting on the 2nd of June at 11 here online about empire and religious education, and how early attempts to influence our education system can still be seen in Australia today. So thanks again very much for joining us today, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you. Thank you.